Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Ew. The village of Halloween stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, where people still whispered old superstitions and lit lanterns instead of streetlights. The air smelled of damp earth and burning wood, and the nights stretched on longer than they should. It was exactly the kind of place Ethan needed. Ethan was a musician, or at least he used to be. His passion for composing had faded over the years, drowned by deadlines, stress, and the overwhelming noise of the city. Every song he wrote felt lifeless, empty, like a hollow echo of something greater. He needed inspiration, something fresh, something real. That was why he had come here, to escape, to listen, to create. His cottage was small but comfortable, perched at the edge of the village where the forest began. The landlord, an old man with a wrinkled face and tired eyes, had warned him about the silence. "You won't hear much music around here," the old man had said, "but if you do, don't follow it. Stay inside. Close your windows. Forget you heard anything." Ethan had laughed, thinking it was just a strange local belief. A warning meant for children, not for him. He was here for inspiration, and if there was music to be heard, he wanted to hear it. The first few days in Halloween were uneventful. Ethan spent his time exploring the village, talking to the locals, and trying to get a feel for the place. The people were kind but distant, always speaking in hushed tones, their eyes shifting toward the forest whenever the wind howled. They avoided certain topics, changing the subject when he asked about the village's history or why there were no churches, no bells, no songs. It wasn't until his fourth night in the village that he heard it, a melody. It was faint at first, almost like the wind carrying a distant hum, but as the night deepened, the sound grew stronger. The voices were beautiful, layered in perfect harmony, rising and falling like waves. It wasn't in any language he recognized, but it didn't matter. The song carried something deeper than words, something ancient, something sorrowful. Ethan stood at his window, staring into the darkness, heart pounding. He had never heard anything like it. It wasn't just music, it was something more, something alive. It called to him, made his fingers twitch with the urge to write, to capture it, to understand it. He stepped outside. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your breath feel heavy. The village was silent except for the singing, which seemed to be coming from deeper within, past the houses, past the cobblestone paths, past the trees that swayed like shadows in the wind. He followed. The deeper he walked, the clearer the voices became. They weren't just singing, they were breathing, whispering between notes, weaving something unseen into the air. His head felt light, his thoughts fuzzy, as if the music was wrapping around his mind, pulling him forward. Then he saw them. A group of figures stood in a clearing, cloaked in darkness. They didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe, only sang. Their faces were pale, their mouths open wide, their eyes gone. Ethan froze. Something was wrong. He tried to step back, but the music held him in place. His chest tightened, his legs trembled, and then a hand grabbed his arm. He turned sharply, his heart nearly bursting from his chest. A woman stood beside him, her face hidden beneath a hood. She whispered, "You shouldn't be here." Ethan gasped, breaking free from whatever hold the music had on him. His feet stumbled backward, and before he could say anything, she pulled him away, dragging him through the trees. The voices behind him didn't stop. They only grew louder. By the time they reached his cottage, Ethan was shaking. The woman let go of his arm and shut the door behind them, bolting it shut. She turned to him, eyes dark and serious. "You heard the song," she said. "You need to leave this village." Ethan swallowed hard, his breath unsteady. "Who are you?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. My name is Lillian. I grew up here. I know what happens to those who listen." Ethan rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "What was that? Who were they?" Lillian's voice was barely above a whisper. "The silent choir." Ethan frowned. But they weren't silent. They were singing. She shook her head. "They aren't supposed to. They only sing at midnight. And those who listen." She trailed off, staring at the floor. Ethan took a deep breath. His hands were still trembling. "I don't understand," he said. "What happens if you listen?" Lillian looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You disappear." Ethan's stomach twisted. "That's ridiculous," he said. "That's just some local legend, right?" Lillian didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the window and peeked outside. The village was silent again, as if nothing had happened. She turned back to him. "You need to stay inside at night. Lock your doors. Block your ears. And whatever you do, don't follow the music again." Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was being paranoid, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't just afraid, she was terrified. After she left, Ethan sat in silence for a long time. His mind was still buzzing, his skin still cold from the air outside. He thought about the song, about the way it had made him feel, about the way it had pulled him in. He wasn't afraid. He was intrigued. And that was the problem. That night, he barely slept. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against him like a weight. He kept thinking about the choir, about their voices, about the way the music had wrapped around him like a living thing. Inspiration. That was what he had come here for. And he had found it. But at what cost? The next day, Ethan couldn't shake the song from his head. It echoed through his mind, lingering in the spaces between his thoughts. He tried to focus on his work, tried to write something, anything, but every melody he composed felt empty compared to what he had heard in the woods. He needed to hear it again. Lillian's warning stuck with him, but curiosity was stronger. He told himself it was just music. No one had been harmed. No one had disappeared. It was just a strange village tradition, a mystery waiting to be uncovered. That evening, he wandered into the village, hoping to ask the locals about the silent choir. But the moment he mentioned them, the mood shifted. Conversations ended. Smiles faded. People hurried away. At the bakery, he asked an elderly woman about the songs. Her hands, wrinkled and frail, trembled as she clutched her apron. She whispered, "They're not meant to be heard." Ethan frowned. "But why?" The woman's gaze darted to the window, as if afraid something might be listening. "Because they are not singing for us," she said. "They sing for the ones who listen too closely." A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "What happens if someone listens?" he asked. The woman hesitated, then whispered, "They vanish. They become part of the choir." Ethan wanted to press further, but she shook her head and retreated behind the counter, refusing to say more. That night, he stayed awake waiting. When the clock struck midnight, the song began. This time, it was clearer, louder. The voices rose in perfect harmony, their sorrowful melody drifting through the air like mist. Ethan sat by his window, gripping his notebook, writing down every note, every shift in pitch. His hands moved quickly, capturing the music before it faded. The moment he finished, the song stopped. Silence fell over the village, thick and heavy. It was as if the world itself had paused. Then, a knock at the door. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the wooden frame, heart pounding. The knock came again, soft but insistent. Slowly, he stood and walked to the door. His fingers hesitated over the handle. "Who is it?" he asked. No answer. His pulse quickened. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, just as he was about to step away, a whisper, low, distant, curling through the cracks of the door. "You heard us." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath hitching. The voice was not a single one but many, layered over each other, speaking in unison. "You heard us." His hands trembled. He reached for the nearest object, a candle holder, gripping it tightly. The voice whispered again. "Let us in." Ethan's blood turned to ice. He squeezed his eyes shut, heart hammering against his ribs. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence returned. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Finally, Ethan exhaled. His hands ached from gripping the candle holder too tightly. Slowly, he backed away from the door, his mind racing. He needed answers. The next morning, he found Lillian by the river, washing clothes. She didn't look surprised to see him, only tired. "You heard them again," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded. "They came to my door." Lillian's hands froze. "Did you open it?" "No," Ethan said. "But they spoke to me." Her face paled. Ethan swallowed hard. "I need to know the truth." "Who are they?" Lillian hesitated before sighing. "Long ago, there was a choir in this village. The most beautiful voices anyone had ever heard. They sang for the church, for the town, for travelers passing through. But one winter, a sickness swept through the land. People died. Families mourned. The church bells rang endlessly. She stared at the water, her voice quiet. The choir sang to comfort them. They sang night after night, their voices carrying through the grief. But the dead, they listened too." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Lillian turned to him. "Something answered their song," she said. "Something old, something that should have stayed asleep. It took them, one by one, until nothing was left but their voices." Ethan shivered. "And now they sing at midnight?" Lillian nodded. "They are trapped between worlds, and those who listen too closely join them." Ethan rubbed his temples. "That's just a story," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Lillian sighed. "Believe what you want. But if they came to your door, it means they've marked you." Ethan's chest tightened. "Marked me for what?" She looked at him with sorrow in her eyes. "They want you to sing." Ethan's stomach twisted. He let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. "That's ridiculous," he said. "I don't even sing." Lillian didn't smile. "It doesn't matter," she said. "They don't care if you can sing or not. They only care that you listened." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then what do I do?" Lillian hesitated. "You leave." Ethan blinked. "What?" "You pack your things and go," she said, voice firm. "Before the next midnight. Before they take you." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, to say that he had come here for inspiration, for music, for something greater than himself. But a cold breeze swept through the air, sending a shiver down his spine. Lillian's gaze was unwavering. "You need to go," she whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. He wanted to protest, but deep down he knew she was right. That night he locked his doors, closed his windows, and packed his bags. His fingers shook as he zipped his suitcase. He would leave at sunrise. He would forget this place. Then, the song began. It was louder this time, rising from the woods, seeping through the walls like fog. The melody curled around him, pulling at his thoughts. His breath caught in his throat. No, he covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. But the song was inside him now. It echoed in his skull, vibrating through his bones. His body swayed before he realized what he was doing. His fingers twitched, tracing the notes in the air. He had to write it down. No, he had to sing. No. Ethan forced himself to step back, to resist. But his feet moved on their own. His lips parted. A voice, his voice, rose with the others. The moment the first note escaped his mouth, the song changed. The choir's voices swelled, wrapping around his own, weaving it into their melody. The room darkened. The walls blurred. Ethan stumbled forward, gasping for breath. No, he was being pulled in. With a final desperate effort, he clamped his mouth shut and tore himself away from the sound. He ran. He didn't stop to grab his suitcase. Didn't stop to breathe. He sprinted through the house, down the stairs, out the door. And the music followed. It whispered through the trees, stretched across the village, winding through the empty streets. Ethan ran toward his car, fumbling for his keys. His vision blurred. His heartbeat roared in his ears. Then, silence. The song stopped. Ethan froze. His fingers hovered over the car door handle. Something was wrong. Slowly he turned. The village was empty. No streetlights. No movement. Nothing but shadows. His breath came in shaky gasps. Then he saw them. Figures in the distance, standing between the trees. Their mouths open, their eyes hollow. Ethan's blood turned to ice. He knew, without a doubt, that they were singing. Even in silence, they were singing. And they were looking at him, waiting. Ethan yanked the car door open and jumped inside. His hands trembled as he turned the key. The engine sputtered. "Come on." The figures stepped closer. Ethan's pulse pounded. The engine roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. The village blurred past him. The forest swallowed the road. He didn't look back. He didn't stop. Not until he was miles away. Not until the music had faded. Not until he reached the city, where the streets were bright and full of life. And yet, that night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his ears still rang with the melody. Soft, haunting, waiting. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. But the song was inside him now, and it would never stop. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his body frozen beneath the covers. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, pale figures standing between the trees, their mouths open in a soundless song. His ears still rang. The melody curled in his thoughts, like a whisper just out of reach. It would fade, he told himself. It had to. By morning, he was exhausted, but the silence of the city gave him a strange kind of comfort. No wind carrying ghostly voices. No unseen choir lurking beyond his window. It was over. It had to be. He went about his day, trying to shake the heaviness in his chest. He ignored the way his fingers twitched, as if longing to write notes that didn't exist. He ignored the way his breath hitched whenever he heard a distant hum of music. By evening, he convinced himself it was just trauma, a trick of the mind. And then at midnight, a single note rang through his apartment. Ethan sat up, heart slamming against his ribs. The room was dark, still. Then, another note, soft, distant, but inside the room. His stomach twisted. No. He stood slowly, his breath shaking. His hands curled into fists. And then he saw it. The mirror across the room. A reflection that wasn't his own. It was him. Same face, same clothes, except his mouth was open, his expression blank. And though the room was silent, Ethan knew. The other him was singing. A cold sweat broke across his skin. He turned away from the mirror, heart hammering. He had to leave. He had to. The music swelled. Ethan clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him. He staggered backward, the room spinning. The walls blurred. His vision darkened. No. No. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his mind to focus. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He stumbled toward the door, reaching blindly. And then, the music stopped. Silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Ethan's breath came in sharp gasps. His body trembled. Slowly, he turned back to the mirror. His reflection stared at him. Normal. Still. His lips were closed. His expression was his own. Ethan swallowed hard. He took a shaky step closer, and then his reflection smiled. A slow, unnatural curl of the lips. Ethan's blood ran cold. The lights flickered. The reflection lifted a hand and knocked on the other side of the glass. Ethan stumbled backward, a strangled noise escaping his throat. The knock echoed through the room. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, the music began again. Not distant, not outside. Inside. Inside the walls. Inside his head. And this time, the voices were calling his name. Ethan's chest tightened as the sound wrapped around him, growing louder, pressing into his skull. His name echoed in the melody, stretching, twisting, like a voice calling from underwater. He stumbled toward the door, reaching for the handle with shaking fingers. He had to get out. He had to. The door wouldn't budge. His breath hitched. He yanked harder. Locked. No, he hadn't locked it. He hadn't. A shadow flickered across the mirror. Ethan turned, heart pounding. His reflection was gone. The mirror showed an empty room. Cold terror crawled up his spine. Then, a breath against his ear. Low, almost amused. Ethan spun, fists clenched, but no one was there. The music swelled. The apartment walls rippled like liquid, warping, distorting. The furniture stretched, shifting in impossible ways. The floor tilted beneath his feet. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was somewhere else. Somewhere cold. Somewhere dark. A forest. The trees loomed around him, skeletal and twisted. The air was thick with mist, pressing against his skin like damp fingers. And in the distance, the choir. They stood between the trees, their mouths open, their bodies swaying. Their voices wove through the air, pulling at his thoughts, his breath, his will. Ethan shook his head, trying to resist. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. A figure stepped forward. Tall, hollow-eyed. Ethan recognized him instantly. The old man from the village. The one who had disappeared. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then slowly he raised a hand and pointed at Ethan. The music shifted. The choir's voices rose, their song becoming urgent, demanding. Ethan's body moved against his will, his feet dragging forward. No, he fought, struggling against the invisible pull. His breath came in ragged gasps. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The figures stepped closer, their mouths stretched wide. Their eyes, empty. Ethan's vision blurred. The world tilted. The music grew deafening. The mist swallowed him whole. Darkness. Then, silence. Ethan opened his eyes. He was back in his apartment. The mirror was intact. The door was unlocked. The room was still. But the song lingered in the air, a whisper just beneath the surface. And in his reflection, a figure stood behind him, mouth open, singing. Ethan's body went rigid. His breath caught in his throat as icy dread seeped into his veins. The figure behind him was tall, its form shrouded in shadow. Its mouth gaped unnaturally wide, yet no sound escaped. But Ethan knew it was singing. The song curled around his mind, threading through his thoughts like invisible tendrils. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn and fight, but he couldn't move. The reflection was holding him in place. His own eyes locked onto his own, yet they weren't his anymore. They were hollow, dark voids where something else peered through. A sharp ringing filled his ears. Then a whisper, so close, so intimate. Ethan, the voice breathed. His name, a command. The air in the room thickened, pressing against him. His pulse pounded against his temples. The figure in the mirror lifted a hand. Ethan felt his own arm rise. No, he wasn't moving it. Something else was. His fingers curled against the glass, mirroring the thing inside. His skin prickled as the cold surface met his palm. The moment he touched it, the mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, yet there was no pain, no blood. Only darkness, rushing toward him like a living thing, swallowing him whole. Then, he was standing in the village again. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of old earth and something rotten beneath it. The cobblestone streets stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with houses whose windows gaped like empty eyes. It was dead silent, too silent. Even the wind had vanished. Ethan's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. He turned slowly, trying to make sense of where he was. Had he dreamt it all? Had he finally lost his mind? A flicker of movement. At the end of the street, near the church, figures stood in a tight circle. The choir, mouths open, swaying. No sound came from them, but Ethan felt it, deep inside his skull, pressing against his bones like a weight. A presence. A call. One of them broke away from the group. A woman. Pale. Hair falling in long, damp strands over her shoulders. She didn't walk. She glided. And her eyes. Black. Hollow. Fixed on him. Ethan stumbled back, his breath ragged. She was whispering something. The sound was just out of reach, slipping between his ears like a song carried by the wind. Then he understood. "Sing," she said. His stomach twisted. "No," he whispered. Her lips curled into something almost human. "You already are." Ethan froze. The realization hit like a knife to the gut. Somewhere, faintly beneath the silence, he could hear his own voice, singing, low, unstoppable. The melody poured from his lips, though his mouth never moved. The woman reached for him, and as her fingers brushed against his skin, the world tilted. The village melted into darkness, and the choir sang louder, calling him home. Ethan's body convulsed as the song burrowed deeper into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a parasite. His legs buckled, but he didn't fall. He hovered weightless, as though unseen hands held him in place. The woman's fingers dug into his wrist, ice cold, pulling him forward. His breath came in sharp gasps, but no sound left his throat, except for the song. His own voice wove into the melody, rising, falling, blending with the others. No, this wasn't real. He had to fight it. He had to wake up. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to move, to resist. His fingers twitched, his muscles tensed, but he couldn't stop singing. The choir loomed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Their mouths stretched impossibly wide, their voices threading together in a harmony too perfect, too unnatural. Ethan's vision blurred. Shapes twisted. The village was gone. The world was gone. Only the song remained. And then, silence. Cold air filled his lungs, sharp and painful. His body collapsed onto rough, wet earth. The scent of damp moss filled his nostrils, the ground slicked beneath his palms. He was somewhere new, somewhere old. The forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches stretching toward the starless sky. A thick fog curled around him, shifting as though it were alive. He turned, scanning the darkness. The choir was gone. The woman was gone. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. Then a sound low and distant. A single voice humming. Ethan's blood ran cold. The melody was familiar. It was the song. It was coming from him. His lips weren't moving, but the sound was there, vibrating in his chest, in his skull, in his very bones. No. No, no, no. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to stop it. His pulse hammered against his ribs, his breath shallow and fast. But the humming continued, a soft, mocking echo in the air. Behind him, Ethan turned slowly. A figure stood among the trees, half hidden in the mist. He couldn't see its face, but he knew. It was him, a perfect copy, mouth open, singing. Ethan staggered back, his throat tightening. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only watched. Then, the song grew louder, and the forest closed in. Ethan turned and ran. His feet pounded against the damp earth, breath ragged, heart slamming against his ribs. The trees blurred past him, their twisted limbs reaching like skeletal fingers. The fog thickened, swirling around his ankles, dragging at his steps. The humming followed. It wasn't coming from behind him anymore. It was everywhere, inside him. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He had to get away. He had to break free. A faint glow flickered through the trees ahead. A warm, golden light, flickering, moving. A lantern. Hope sparked in his chest. Someone was there. He forced his legs to move faster, his lungs burning as he pushed forward. The light bobbed gently, swaying with each step of the person carrying it. "Help!" Ethan gasped. His voice came out hoarse, broken. The humming wavered. The lantern's glow flared brighter. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, You shouldn't have listened. The light snapped out. The forest plunged into total blackness. Ethan skidded to a stop, his body trembling. A sharp rustling filled the air. Leaves stirred. Branches creaked. Something was moving all around him. No, not something. Many things. Shadows shifted in the fog, shapes slithering between the trees. Their outlines were wrong, bodies stretched too tall, limbs bending at unnatural angles. Mouths opened in silent screams. And behind them, the choir. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, their heads tilted as they listened. Ethan clutched his head. The song was louder now, wrapping around his skull like a vice. He staggered backward, his vision swimming. He had to wake up. He had to end this. He turned to run, but a hand shot out from the fog, gripping his wrist with inhuman strength. Ethan gasped, yanking back, but the fingers dug in, ice-cold, unrelenting. Then another hand, and another. They pulled him down, into the earth, into the song, and the forest disappeared. Ethan fell. The world around him twisted, unraveling into darkness and sound. The song swelled, vibrating through his bones, wrapping around his thoughts like a vice. It was inside him now, a part of him. He crashed on a solid ground, the impact jarring through his body. His hands scraped against rough stone, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and something metallic, something like blood. Slowly, he pushed himself up. He was no longer in the forest. The space around him was vast, cavernous. Faint blue light pulsed from cracks in the stone walls, casting shifting shadows. The ceiling arched high above him, lost in darkness. The floor was smooth, worn down by countless footsteps. A whisper of movement echoed in the distance. Ethan turned sharply. Figures stood at the edges of the cavern, half hidden in the gloom. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the eerie light. Their lips moved soundlessly, mouthing the words of a song only he could hear. The silent choir. They were everywhere. Their bodies swayed in rhythm, heads tilting in unison. Their faces were expressionless, empty, except for their mouths, which never stopped moving. Ethan's throat tightened. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. His pulse pounded in his ears. A voice whispered behind him, "You were chosen." He spun around. The woman from the village stood mere inches away, her pale face framed by the flickering light. She watched him with an unsettling calm, her dark eyes empty of any human warmth. Ethan staggered back, shaking his head. No, I didn't. I don't want this." She stepped forward, her hands outstretched. It's already begun. Ethan's lips parted, and the song poured out. A beautiful, haunting melody, sung in perfect harmony with the choir. The sound filled the cavern, rising, expanding, threading through the air like mist. No, this wasn't him. He clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to stop, trying to break free. His body trembled, muscles locking into place. He was losing himself. The woman watched, her expression unreadable. "You listened," she said softly. "And now you belong to the song." Ethan's vision blurred. His limbs grew heavy. The choir moved closer. He tried to scream, but all that came out was music. The music engulfed him, suffocating, consuming. His chest heaved with desperate, silent breaths, but the song continued, filling his lungs, his thoughts, his soul. His body moved on its own, jerking in time with the choir, as if he had no choice but to join them. He couldn't stop it. He couldn't fight it. The woman's eyes gleamed with something ancient, something predatory. She watched him, expression frozen, her lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "You'll sing with us," she murmured, her voice a thread in the vast silence, forever. All of us, bound together by the song. The realization hit like a cold slap to the face. The choir wasn't just a group of singers. They were trapped. Trapped by the song, trapped by the place, by whatever dark force had created them. And now so was he. No, he refused to be like them. He struggled, pushing against the pull of the music, trying to claw his way free of the invisible chains that held him. But the more he fought, the more it consumed him. The woman stepped closer, her voice soft but unyielding. "It's too late to resist. The music has already claimed you." Ethan's mind screamed for release, but his body was no longer his own. His lips parted, and the song poured out of him, a sweet, mournful melody that he knew wasn't his. It came from somewhere else, somewhere ancient, from the deep, dark corners of this cursed place. The choir stepped forward in perfect unison, their voices rising with his, harmonizing, blending in a way that felt unnatural, as if the sound itself was too pure, too perfect. The cavern seemed to stretch with the weight of it, the walls vibrating, the air thick with an oppressive presence. Ethan's legs moved of their own accord, taking him toward the center of the cavern, where the others stood. He was drawn to them, like a moth to a flame, his movements no longer his own. The woman reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek as she whispered, "This is what you sought, wasn't it? Inspiration, purity in sound." Her voice was sweet, almost mocking. "You found it, but it's not the kind of beauty you expected." Ethan's mind reeled, trying to process, to break free, but the melody clouded his thoughts. The music had become his world, and it was everything. He was nothing but a note in the song. But then, a flicker, a thought buried deep within the fog of his mind. A memory, the village, the warnings, the old man, the lantern. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He had to focus. He had to think. The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts, her fingers still lightly resting on his skin. "You think you can escape? The song is everything. It always was." The choir continued, their voices growing louder, blending into one terrifying, unearthly sound that vibrated through his entire body. But Ethan had an idea, a faint spark of a plan. The lantern, the light. He remembered the old man, the stories, the village elders who had whispered about the song's origin. There was a way to escape, a way to break the hold. He just had to focus. With everything he had left, Ethan pulled his mind from the music, forcing his thoughts to align. He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the image of the lantern, the glow, the warmth. The woman's laughter echoed in his mind. "There is no escape. You are part of us now." But Ethan's grip on his thoughts tightened. He focused, and for a brief moment he heard it, the softest whisper, barely audible above the choir's song. "Break the light." The words were faint, like a distant call, but they burned into his brain with a sudden clarity. His eyes snapped open again, and everything came rushing back. The cavern, the choir, the woman, the song. There was a way, but it would cost everything. The woman's grip tightened on Ethan's arm, her fingers digging into his skin like ice, as if she could feel the moment his resolve began to shift. Her eyes darkened, pupils contracting into tiny slits, the faint glow fading into shadows. "You can't escape. The song has already taken root." Her voice was colder now, tinged with something venomous. "Even if you break the light, the song will never let you go." Ethan's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, the melody still swirling around him, tightening around his heart like a vice. But there was something in the back of his mind, something pushing him forward, whispering one word, light. His hands shook, but he pushed them out in front of him, palms facing the choir, the woman. He didn't know what he was doing, but the words, "break the light," echoed louder and louder in his mind. Without thinking, he reached deep within himself, summoning the last bit of strength he could muster. His fingers curled into fists, and with a cry of desperation, he slammed them into the cold stone floor beneath him. For a moment, nothing happened. The song didn't stop. The air didn't shift. But then a crack ran through the ground like a bolt of lightning, splitting the cavern floor from the center and spreading outward. A pulse, a single blinding flash of light. It erupted from the crack, flooding the cavern with a brilliant, white-hot glow. The choir halted. The song faltered, breaking into 1,000 disjointed notes that clashed and screamed in the air. The woman recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. The glow from the crack grew stronger, brighter, until the entire cavern seemed to glow with it. Ethan couldn't look away. The light was pure, it was freeing, and as it blazed through him, he felt the song lose its grip on his mind. The pull of the choir weakened, the hold on his body slackening. And oh, the woman shrieked, but the sound was swallowed by the light. She reached out, trying to shield herself, but it was useless. The light expanded, pushing back the shadows, growing brighter with each second. Ethan stumbled backward, his body weak from the strain, but he didn't stop. He felt the energy surging through him. His chest felt lighter, freer with each breath he took. The light was the key, the answer. As the light pulsed, the figures of the choir writhed and shrieked, their once harmonious voices now a chaotic, maddening cacophony. One by one, their bodies began to disintegrate, vanishing into the light like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The woman screamed, her body twisting in agony as the light tore through her, breaking her apart, piece by piece. Ethan collapsed to his knees, eyes squeezed shut against the overwhelming brightness. He could feel the weight of the song lifting, the crushing force of it releasing its hold on his mind. The light flared one final time, and then it was gone. The cavern returned to its oppressive stillness, the air thick and heavy once more. Ethan blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness. The ground beneath him was solid again. The oppressive sense of being watched now faded. The figures were gone. The song was silent. But something was different. The air felt emptier. Ethan rose shakily to his feet. The woman was gone, the choir was gone, but there was still a lingering presence, something faint in the corners of his mind. Something that whispered in the quietest moments, that brushed against his thoughts when he was alone. He didn't know if the song was truly gone, if it would come back, but for now he was free. He staggered toward the exit of the cavern, his steps unsteady, his mind still reeling. The soft echoes of the song remained, distant but persistent, like an unanswered call from far away. Ethan knew he had to leave this place. He had to go back. He had to find a way to escape the echoes that would follow him, no matter how far he ran. But deep down, he understood there was no real escaping the choir. Not completely. It would always be there, waiting. And when the night grew quiet and the wind howled just right, he would hear their voices again. He would hear the song. Ethan's footsteps echoed through the cavern as he staggered toward the exit, his breath shallow, his mind spinning with the aftermath of everything that had just happened. The light, the choir, the woman, they were gone, but something lingered in the air. A heavy, unsettling silence that clung to him like a second skin. The edges of his vision felt blurry, as though reality itself were still trying to reassemble itself after the disruption. The forest outside was still eerily quiet. The fog had cleared, but it had left behind an unnatural stillness. Even the trees seemed to have stopped moving. Ethan breathed in deeply, trying to shake off the tightness in his chest. The air outside felt different, colder but fresher, as if the world itself had been reset, just like the cavern. But his relief was short-lived. The faintest trace of music, soft, barely perceptible, drifted on the wind. A single, isolated note, like a thread of sound being tugged from the depths of his mind. Ethan froze. No. He turned back toward the forest, toward the path that led him deeper into the village. The song was gone, wasn't it? It had disappeared when the light shattered the cavern, when the woman and the choir were consumed. But now it was here again, tugging at the edges of his thoughts. It was as if the music were following him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, the earth softening as he walked. The trees around him loomed taller now, their branches reaching out like fingers, stretching across the sky to block the last remnants of daylight. And in the distance, he could just make out the faintest flicker of light, the same golden glow he'd seen in the forest earlier, just before everything had spiraled out of control. Ethan moved toward it, the pulsing of the light pulling him like a magnet. It felt as though the very air was being drawn to it, as though the village was alive in a way it hadn't been before. He hesitated, standing at the edge of the village, the familiar houses looking different now, darker, more imposing. There was no one around. The streets were empty, as though the whole place had been abandoned. He stepped forward cautiously, his pulse quickening. The light flickered again, just ahead of him. He reached the village square, and there, standing in the center, was the lantern. But it wasn't just any lantern. It was the same one he'd seen in the woman's hands, the one that had seemed to hold the last vestiges of light before he had broken free from the song. This time, it was glowing with an unnatural brilliance, casting long shadows that stretched far across the square. Ethan approached it, drawn to it against his better judgment. His hand reached out toward it, trembling. "Don't," a voice whispered from behind him. He spun around, heart racing. The village was empty. The streets stretched endlessly in all directions, barren. And yet there, standing at the edge of the square, was the old man, the one who had warned him. "You don't understand," the old man said, his voice low, hoarse, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You think the song is gone, but it's never truly gone. It can't be. Not now. It's in you, Ethan. It's part of you." Ethan's mouth went dry. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The air seemed to vibrate around them, as if the ground itself was holding its breath. The old man's gaze was unyielding, his eyes dark and hollow. "You were never meant to leave. The village, the choir, it all calls to those who are destined to join. You were chosen long before you set foot here." Ethan took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. The light from the lantern flickered once more, casting an eerie glow over the old man's face. What are you saying? I've already broken the song. I've ended it." The old man shook his head slowly. "You think you broke it? But the song doesn't work that way. The song, it doesn't end, Ethan. It simply waits. And now it's waiting for you." Ethan's blood ran cold. No, that's not true. I'm free. I stopped it." The old man's expression softened for the briefest moment, and then, in the next instant, it hardened again. "You can run. You can hide. But the song will find you. And when it does, when it calls again, you'll be too weak to resist. No one ever escapes." Ethan shook his head violently, unwilling to accept the truth that was starting to seep into his bones. "I don't believe you. I've already done it. The ground beneath his feet trembled. Then in the distance, just beyond the edge of the square, he heard it, the faintest whisper, the sound of voices, soft and haunting, threading through the air. The choir, the song, it was returning. Ethan stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. The old man's words echoed in his mind, relentless. "It's in you. It's part of you." The music grew louder. It surrounded him, pulsing in his ears, vibrating in his chest. The figures of the choir appeared in the shadows, their ghostly forms emerging from the darkness, their eyes glowing in the night. Ethan's body trembled, and he could feel it, just like before, the song reaching into his chest, squeezing, pulling him back into its grip. The force of it was overpowering, threatening to tear him apart. His hands shook as he reached for his ears, trying to block it out, trying to shut it off. But it didn't stop. It couldn't. The music rose around him like a tidal wave, and he understood there was no escape. Not from the song, not from the choir. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness he heard their voices, soft and sweet, calling his name. And this time he listened. Ethan's mind blurred. The voices of the choir, their song, saturated his senses, threading through every thought, every feeling, until there was nothing left but the sound of their haunting melody. He opened his eyes, but the world around him was no longer familiar. The village had shifted, twisted in some unfathomable way. The shadows had deepened, swallowing the streets, the houses, everything. The lantern at the center of the square was now a glaring beacon, too bright, too insistent, pulling him toward it like a moth to a flame. But this time, Ethan didn't resist. His body moved on its own, a marionette caught in the rhythm of the song. His feet carried him forward, and his mouth opened, joining in the chorus, singing the words he never knew he knew. The air was thick with an ancient power, and he felt himself sinking into it, melting into the music. The choir surrounded him, their forms indistinct, their faces just out of focus, but their voices, those voices, wrapped around him like a blanket, cold and suffocating. He tried to fight it, tried to remind himself that this wasn't real, that he wasn't one of them, but the music was all-consuming. It drowned out every thought, every protest. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the song, his pulse thumping in time with the eerie harmonies, and soon, it didn't matter whether he was human or something else. It didn't matter that he had fought. He was part of the choir now. He was part of the song. The woman, her cold, dispassionate smile, appeared in front of him, her presence somehow both comforting and terrifying. She reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his face, her fingers as cold as ice. "You're home now," she whispered. Her voice was soft, sweet, like honey, but there was something far darker beneath it. "You will never leave again." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. His throat was dry, the air thick and oppressive. All he could do was sing, to join in with the others, to be part of something greater than himself. The music was his lifeblood now. The other members of the choir shifted around him, their voices blending into a seamless, celestial harmony, and for a moment, it felt like he was floating, untethered, free from everything that had ever held him down. His mind, his body, his soul, everything was swallowed up by the song, and the sensation was pure bliss. But there was a part of him, a small, quiet voice buried deep inside, that screamed out in protest. He wasn't meant to be here. This was wrong. He had been chosen. But for what? The answer came to him in a flash of horror. The song was never meant to end. It never truly stopped. It simply waited, like a predator, until its next victim was ready to give in. The choir wasn't a group of musicians. It was a collection of souls, trapped in eternal song. Those who came to listen, those who tried to escape, became part of the music. Their bodies vanished, their lives erased. And now it was Ethan's turn. He stumbled backward, his chest heaving with desperation. His hands shot to his ears, but the music flooded in unstoppable. He could feel the others closing in on him, their ethereal forms taking shape, their eyes filled with an endless hunger. The woman was there, watching him, her lips curling in that same predatory smile. "You can't escape it," she said, her voice sweet but laced with an undeniable malice. "The song is everything. And now you are part of it." Ethan could feel it, the overwhelming weight of their gaze, the pressure of their voices, the unbearable pull of the song. His body trembled with the force of it, his legs giving way beneath him as he collapsed to his knees, unable to resist any longer. The cold, endless darkness of the choir's world pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating, drowning him in a flood of sound. But then, a crack, the smallest fracture in the unyielding wall of music. Ethan's mind cleared, just for a moment. His breath slowed, and the pressure on his chest lessened. He looked around, trying to focus, trying to see something, anything, that could give him an escape. The shadows of the village were no longer solid. They rippled like water, fading in and out of existence. The lantern, still glowing brightly in the center of the square, flickered. The light was dimming, as though the power that had fueled it was starting to wane. Could it be? Was it possible? Ethan's hands shot out, grabbing the ground beneath him, pulling himself to his feet. He could feel the song pulling at him, but this time he fought back. The lantern was the key. It had to be. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he staggered toward the light, pushing against the overwhelming force of the song that tried to tear him apart. The choir's voices rose louder, sharper, but he couldn't stop now. The light was his only chance. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to hum, the pressure in his head intensifying. The lantern was within arm's reach. Just a little further. He reached out, and in that moment, everything went silent. The song vanished. The voices. The music. The endless pull of the choir. For the briefest of moments, the world stood still. Ethan's hand hovered above the lantern, the light flickering faintly in his vision. He could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow, as he stood on the precipice of his own fate. He grabbed it, and everything exploded. The explosion of light was blinding. Ethan's entire body was consumed by it, as if the very essence of the lantern had reached out and wrapped around him. He felt weightless, like he was being pulled into a vast, endless expanse. The world around him faded, and the air seemed to vanish entirely. For a moment, there was nothing but pure, searing white. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the light faded. Ethan gasped for air, his lungs burning as though he had been holding his breath for far too long. He opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light that now surrounded him. His body was still trembling, and the faintest echo of the song, soft, distant, and haunting, lingered at the edges of his mind. But when he looked around, he saw something that nearly shattered him. He was back in the village square, but it wasn't the same. The streets were bathed in a cold, gray light, and the air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on him. The lantern was still there, but it no longer glowed. Its once brilliant flame had turned to a dull, sickly flicker, as though it were struggling to stay alive. The trees, too, looked different, twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers that seemed to grasp for the sky. It was the village, but not the village he knew. Ethan staggered backward, his mind racing. What had happened? Where were the choir? Where was the woman? His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned in frantic circles, searching for some sign of life. But there was nothing. No one. He was alone. The music was still there, faint but persistent, like a whisper in the distance. It wasn't the same as before. The soft, harmonious tones had been replaced by something darker, more oppressive. The song was no longer just a melody. It was a presence, a force that clung to everything, suffocating everything around him. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to ignore the pull of the song, the way it seemed to crawl beneath his skin. He had to get out. He had to escape this place, whatever it was. He wasn't supposed to be here. The choir was gone. The village, it was cursed, lost. The lantern had opened a door. But where was that door leading him? He took a step forward, but his legs felt weak, unsteady. The air was too thick, as though it had solidified into something he couldn't break through. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into this strange, distorted version of the village. The houses loomed around him like empty shells, the windows staring blankly, void of life. And then from behind him, he heard a sound. A soft whisper, so faint he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. Ethan. His blood froze. The voice was familiar. It was hers, the woman, the one who had spoken to him in the cavern, the one whose presence had been woven into the fabric of the song. But it didn't sound the same now. It was colder, distant, as though she were speaking from another place entirely. Another time. Ethan. The voice called again, but this time it was not just one voice. It was many. A chorus. A choir. Their voices rose, filling the air around him, and for a brief moment the world seemed to flicker, like an image caught between two frames, one of reality and one of something darker. And in that flickering he saw them. The choir. They were standing at the edge of the square, their forms almost transparent, but their eyes, those eyes, burned through the darkness. They were watching him, waiting. Their faces were expressionless, void of emotion, but their eyes were full of hunger. The woman was there, too, her figure standing in front of the others, her cold smile twisted into something crueler now. She was different. There was a weight to her presence, an undeniable authority that hadn't been there before. "Ethan," she said again, stepping closer. "You are one of us now." His heart pounded in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. One of us. No, that couldn't be true. He couldn't be part of them. He had escaped. He had broken the song. He had stopped it. But the truth was undeniable. The choir was here, and they weren't leaving. They were waiting for him. He took a step back, his mind reeling. He couldn't stay. He couldn't let them take him. But then, before he could turn and run, something happened. The world around him began to shift again. The edges of the village warped, bending and twisting in impossible ways. The houses melted into shadows, the trees became twisted, dark shapes. The air thickened, pressing down on him like a vice. His breath became labored as the song rose in intensity, surrounding him, trapping him in its grip. It was too much. Ethan staggered, his knees buckling beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, his hands pressed to his ears, trying to block out the music, but it was everywhere. The voices of the choir filled the air, their song rising, louder and louder, until it was all he could hear. And then he understood. This wasn't a place. It wasn't a village. It wasn't even a reality. This was the song. The song was the place. It had consumed everything, everyone. The village, the people, it was all just an echo, a memory of the music. And now, it was him that the song had claimed. The woman knelt before him, her cold hand brushing against his cheek. Her eyes were full of something darker now, something ancient, something that spoke of endless time, of an eternity spent in the song. "You can't leave," she whispered softly. "None of us can." Ethan's vision blurred, the world spinning around him as the voices of the choir reached their peak. And as his mind fractured, as his body became numb with the force of the music, he could feel it. He could feel himself slipping away. Not into death, into the song. The music was all-encompassing now. The voices of the choir swirled around Ethan, drowning out his thoughts, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The woman's hand remained on his cheek, cold as ice, her touch a cruel reminder of what he had become. The faces of the choir surrounded him, their eyes empty, their mouths singing in perfect harmony. But their song no longer sounded beautiful. It was a twisted, broken thing, full of sorrow, regret, and hunger. Ethan's body was no longer his own. His hands were frozen at his sides, his legs stiff beneath him. The choir had claimed him, and he could feel it, like an insidious presence wrapping around his soul. The woman spoke again, her voice sweet but hollow. "You're part of us now, Ethan. Forever." The words cut through him like a knife. The thought of never leaving, of being trapped in this endless song, tore at his heart. His chest tightened with the weight of it, his breath shallow, his body trembling with the weight of the curse he had inherited. But even as he was consumed by the music, something deep inside him stirred. A flicker of defiance, a sliver of hope. No, he couldn't accept this. He wouldn't. With every ounce of willpower left in him, he fought back. His body trembled as he tried to move, as he tried to break free from the music, the voices, the endless pull of the choir. It was as though his very existence was being ripped apart by their song, but he refused to yield. He had to fight, and then, in that brief moment of clarity, he realized the truth. The song didn't just control the village. It controlled everything, the land, the people, the very fabric of reality itself. It had trapped him here, just as it had trapped them. It wasn't just a song. It was a curse, an ancient force that fed on souls, using the music as a vessel to claim them, to drown them in its endless, sorrowful lullaby. Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find a way out, a way to break the curse. He had to silence the song, stop the choir from consuming him completely. But how? He looked around frantically, and his gaze landed on the lantern, the flickering, dying light at the center of the square. The lantern was the key. It had always been the key. The song began with it, and it would end with it. He could feel it now, the faint pulse of energy still radiating from the lantern. It was weak, but it was there. If he could reach it, if he could reignite its light, perhaps he could break the curse. Perhaps he could stop the song. He gathered every last shred of strength, and with a strangled cry, he pushed himself to his feet. The choir's voices rose in an agonizing crescendo, trying to drag him back down, but he didn't listen. He stumbled toward the lantern, each step heavy and unsteady, his body protesting against the pull of the music, against the weight of the curse that clung to him. The woman's laughter rang out behind him, cold and cruel. "You can't escape, Ethan. You belong to us now." But Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His hand reached out toward the lantern, trembling as he closed the distance between himself and the dying light. And when his fingers brushed against its cold surface, something incredible happened. The lantern flared to life. The light burst forth in a sudden, blinding flash, filling the square with a brilliant, purifying glow. The song faltered, the voices screeching in agony as the light pushed back against the darkness that had enveloped the village. Ethan's body trembled with the force of it, but he didn't let go. He held on, his hand locked firmly around the lantern's base, feeling the power surge through him. The choir screamed, their voices distorting into something unearthly as the light intensified. The woman, their leader, screeched in fury, her face contorting with rage. "No, you can't." But her voice was drowned out by the brilliance of the light, and slowly, one by one, the figures of the choir began to fade, their forms dissolving into the light, their haunting song silenced at last. And then, with a final, thunderous crack, the lantern shattered. The light exploded outward in a brilliant wave, sweeping across the village, tearing apart the cursed land, the twisted trees, the empty houses. The village itself began to unravel, crumbling into dust, as the song that had held it all together vanished into nothing. And Ethan fell to his knees, gasping for breath, as the world around him collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan lay on the ground, his body broken, his mind foggy. The remnants of the lantern were scattered across the square, its light gone. The village was no more. The choir was gone. Everything was gone. He struggled to rise, his legs weak beneath him. His hands trembled as he pushed himself to his feet. But when he looked around, there was nothing left. No twisted village. No haunting song. No woman. Just the stillness. The world around him was quiet, eerily so. The air felt lighter now, as if a great weight had been lifted from the land. The trees were no longer gnarled and warped. The streets were clear. It was like waking from a nightmare, the remnants of the horror fading into the distance. But Ethan knew. He knew he could never forget. He could never forget the song, the choir, the curse. And though the village was gone, though the music had been silenced, something deep inside him whispered, it wasn't truly over. The song would always remain. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.